Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Christian Anthropology Study Day 2. So, in our live discussion later, I might give some feedback on essays. There are one or two trickling in already. I'm recording this kind of 2 weeks ahead of our scheduled class. So impressed that one or two have already shown in. In the past, I would have corrected them early, but when Peter was here, he was very keen that all the essays went out at the same time. I'm not sure is that going to continue or not, but for the moment, I'm going to be cautious and wait until I'm told or not told before I start correcting, and release the marks. So, I know that obviously by the time you see this, the assignments will be over, and some of you will be thinking towards exams. So those of you with me previously will know that tutorial day 2 will be the time when I will give you very clear guidance on the specifics of the exam questions. The reason I'm not going to do that today is because Priory are very, very, very keen on me not to do that. And again, it's about making sure that there is a consistency across the tutor spectrum, if you like, so that in some courses people are told earlier than others. So the next day we will speak more directly about essay titles. Nonetheless, those of you who were with me last year will know that there is, let's say, significant overlap between my essay topics and the exam questions. They're obviously not exactly, they can't be exactly the same because basically the Priory and their external examiner do not allow that. But if you want to get a head start on your exam preparation, look at your essay titles, and as you know, you will have a choice of 5 questions excuse me, for your exam. You do 3. We haven't been told yet officially, we as tutors haven't been told officially yet about what format the exams will be this year. Obviously historically it was a written exam of 2 hours in here and other venues around the country, but I'm in the Priory in Tala at the moment. So it could be I'm guessing though that because of the COVID numbers it will be the same type of exam you had last year. Those of you who were with us last year, which is you get a week basically to answer 3 questions. So we've talked about some topics like suffering. The last day, as you might remember, we talked about sin. We talked earlier about the way our understanding of Jesus, our Christology, shapes so much of our Christian anthropology, and indeed, as we heard in the live session the last day, our theology as well. So one topic that we haven't, 2 topics we probably need to touch in more detail are the question of science and faith, which is what I'm going to focus on today, and then the next day, as well as I'm sorry, got something in my throat here. As well as talking to you about the questions the next day, I will also talk to you then about something I touched briefly on the last day, which is perhaps retweaking our understanding of death and what that might mean. So let's talk then about science. Now, the last day we were talking about sin. I was explaining about a paradigm shift that took place in the Church's understanding of sin after Vatican II. And in some ways, our discussion on science mirrors that discussion, because basically pre-Vatican II, the Church was quite hostile to science. After Vatican II, that hostility diminishes significantly. And can you have heard me previously talking about the phrase partnering conversation? So after Vatican II, and particularly in the papacy of John Paul II, science becomes a partnering conversation with theology and with the Catholic Church in particular. And John Paul II was someone who led that debate very much. And if you go, there are books available on the writings of John Paul II, but it's quite interesting when you look at them to see how much time he spent in correspondence with scientists and researchers, and actually how many conferences of theirs he attended to present the church teaching, and also to, I suppose, for his own sake, to upskill himself, so that he was in touch with the changing face of science. Now, that didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened as a result of a whole new change. And I think one of the phrases you can expect at some point is that in the past, the church and science were enemies. And I suppose the question is, today, could they become allies? Or even could they used to be strangers, now potentially could they be friends? So I suppose it's our essay title and our exam title will be kind of exploring the old attitude and the more modern attitude. Again, personified and typified by Pope John Paul II in particular. So, to understand the Church's attitude to science, it's impossible to do it in a vacuum. Again, like the last time, to understand the Church's teaching on sin, and there's a whole web of influences that caused the Church to have, for much of its history, a kind of a hostile attitude to science. However, again, we need to be cautious and not to make sweeping statements, because, for instance, the science of genetics was founded by an Augustinian monk, Mendel. So I suppose some of the crude stereotypes about the Church's hostility to science are just that, crude stereotypes, and that there was it was an oversimplification to say the Church was always hostile to science. There were, as with most things in life, there was an element of nuance, an element of greyness rather than just black and white. So where do we begin? I think, again, at the risk of repeating myself, we have to go back to Augustine, and to understand, like as I mentioned to you in the last day when it came to our discussion on sin and morality, basically our understanding of sin is shaped by our understanding of morality. And our understanding of science is shaped by the Church's attitude, not just to science, but to the world at large. So how do we grasp that? We grasp that by trying to look at what were the forces that shaped, or who were the influences that shaped the church's attitude to the world. And again, for 1500 years, one of the most important figures was Augustine. And again, to understand that, you need to understand his context. So, Augustine, as I mentioned the last day, was very concerned about the moral laxity of the times, which meant people living as he would have seen it after he converted, very sinful lives. And he knew what a sinful life was because he himself had lived a sinful life before his conversion. So what did he do then, or what was he trying to counter? So he was trying to counter an attitude that was based on too cozy a relationship between faith and the world. That, in other words, it was possible for believers to easily coexist in the world and at the same time be a person of faith. Augustine felt that was much more problematic. So what did he do, or what did he say, or how did he try and get around that? So, as I mentioned the last day, at its core, what Augustine presented was a dualistic philosophy. Body is bad, soul is good, this world is bad, the next world is good. Now, this world is bad. To understand church teaching in that area, it's kind of critical. You've heard me before, quoting Gustavo Guterres, we do not do theology from an innocent place. So at the core of Augustine's teaching was a presupposition that the world is bad. So what do you do if you want to get to the next world, which is what Augustine believed is what all Christians should be aiming for? So the way you did that was by disengaging from the world as much as possible. And I suppose in Augustine's life, that was relatively easy to do, because most people were not educated, most people didn't have any money, most people's sole interest was the constant struggle to put food on the table for themselves and their families. And when you're doing that, so many people are on the borderline between existing and living, you're very preoccupied with questions like, will there be enough wheat to make flour that will make the bread that will keep us alive during the long dark days of winter? And in that kind of mode, you're not really going to have the time or the energy for engaging in an awful lot of sinful behaviour. It's only people like Augustine himself, generally, who are people of leisure, who had the time to engage in massive sensory pleasures, let's call it that, to use a nice euphemism. So what do you need instead? You need basically you're praying to God that the crops will yield a rich harvest, and you'll have enough to keep you and your family going. And your concerns are very much very narrow kind of concerns, and you're not really thinking too much about this world and the next world, except you believe that the good God is out there, and he will give you a rich harvest if you're dutiful and prayerful and you pray hard for a good harvest and things like that. Now, what starts to happen though is that gradually society gets more complicated, and a couple of things that start to happen. One is slowly, the Industrial Revolution, as you know, doesn't come till the 19th century, 18th, 19th century in the UK initially, and then spread its wings. So, but nonetheless, there were little pockets of the beginning of an industrial economy beginning to emerge in the Western world, and there was also a new administrative class emerging in the Western world, a kind of a modern day civil service. And these were people then who were people of money and people of privilege, people of education, and they had the time to speculate and to kind of talk to people like Augustine about the meaning of life. And if you're really struggling to put food on the table, the question about the meaning of life is so far removed from your day-to-day existence. But when you're lifted out of that, vicious circle of poverty, other questions then emerge, and you can spend some time probing those questions. So, in Augustine's time, things were starting to change, and there was a more educated class, a more sophisticated class, who were asking these big philosophical discussions, and Augustine was happy to entertain them. And basically, he believed that our duty is to get to heaven. So what did we do to get to heaven? We do everything we can to avoid anything that's going to stop us from getting to heaven. And where was this threat coming from that was blocking our ability to get to heaven? Where were the stumbling blocks? You've heard me previously talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his idea between cheap grace and costly grace. But Bonhoeffer used that phrase a lot about the idea of stumbling blocks. That there are things that can literally block our path towards a relationship with God. Now, Augustine though took it even more extreme, and he basically felt that anything to do with the world is a blockage to our relationship with God, and therefore to be avoided. Which is why, for Augustine, highest ideal is virginity, ultimate rejection of the world. But also other things as well, politics, to be ignored. Why? Because politics was a corrupting influence, as Augustine would have seen it. So, in his writings, then, Augustine makes the distinction between two cities: the earthly city and the heavenly city. And basically, the destination is the heavenly city, and the earthly city is full of these stumbling blocks that can trip people up and stop them from getting to heaven. So obviously, in that perspective, as we mentioned the last day, sin is the big stumbling block. Where did sin happen? For Augustine, it happened mainly to do in areas like sexuality. So sex and the body. The body bad. So if the body is bad, sexuality obviously is bad as well. And okay, within marriage, if it leads to procreation, it's tolerable, it's tolerated, just about. And obviously, again, Vatican II has changed that. with its understanding that Pope John Paul II again is driven of the language of the body. That sexuality is not just about procreation, but it's about the encounter between the spouses and the male and female, and that sexuality is about a journey that the couple are on, a journey of exploration of love, a journey of exploration that includes sexual expression. So the next time, by the way, you hear someone shoot down Catholic teaching on sexuality and say it's outdated, just make sure you ask them, do they actually know what Catholic teaching on sexuality today is? Because in my experience, most people have an outdated understanding of sexuality, the old Augustinian understanding, whereas the John Paul II understanding, language of the body, much more positive, much more human, much more holistic, and much more grounded in love. The love between the spouses, and how sexuality is about a growth, can facilitate a growth in love between the spouses. So, in rejecting the world, and in rejecting the body, and rejecting the pleasures of the body, Augustine is firmly based on the path of the dualistic understanding. And as after Augustine dies, at the time of his death, basically there aren't universities in the way that we would know them today, at least not in the numbers that we would know them. There were centres of learning, obviously, and we know, from those of you who were with me last year, in the Celtic tradition, places like Clonmacnoise, in Ireland, Glendalough, were great centres of learning. But it is not until kind of the Middle Ages that there is the emergence of a university growth throughout the Western world. And what that does is that it brings a new level of intellectual life and creation of a new class, the intelligentsia, who are asking important questions. Now, what tends to happen at the risk of oversimplification is that there are two types of intelligentsia. There are Christian intelligentsia, or Catholic as in universal, because obviously the Reformation hadn't happened yet, and people didn't use the word Catholic as we would have used, as we would use it today. Back then, because that type of Catholicism did not exist until after the Reformation. So the growth of the intellectual class is very significant, because now people are interested in learning. In tandem with the growth of universities is the beginnings of the growth, and it was largely again driven by the church, and particularly by new religious orders, the growth of hospitals. And what did hospitals do? Hospitals basically changed the understanding of medicine, because basically in its earlier phase, the doctor was the doctor for all. So basically, today we, as you know, we have a very compartmentalized approach to medicine. So if I get the flu, I go to the GP. If someone has a cancer issue, they go to cancer specialist. If someone has a kidney issue, they go to a kidney specialist. If someone has a heart issue, they go to a cardiac surgeon, and so on and so on. So two things are happening now. There is the growth of universities and the emergence of a thirst for knowledge, but also the development of hospitals and the creation of a new set in the world of intellectual life, which is medicine, and out of that then grows medical science. So universities emerging in a much more prominent, taking up a more prominent space in intellectual life. And again, that could not happen without the prosperity I mentioned earlier. So basically the prosperity bankrolled, if you like, the growth of medicines and medical science, but also through contributions to the religious orders to build hospitals and paying of dues. Now obviously, say Jews, D-U-E-S, Jews, that couldn't have happened without the growth in the economic class, and certainly that administrative growth, that civil service class, would not have been possible without greater economic activity. And the university life was the high point of that, and it meant then that within the intelligentsia there was a demand for the children of wealthy people, the boys in particular, to go to university. And obviously, to some extent, there was a keeping up with the Joneses element of that as well. So, but science in the Middle Ages is starting to gain a foothold into the Western world, and initially it's kind of not a huge deal, but things start to get more problematic when science start to put forward alternative explanations to the church's explanation. Now we're a long way yet from the Darwin and the origin of the species, but as things unfold, new scientists emerge, like Galileo and Copernicus, for instance, a bit further on, who start to come up and suggest theories and conduct experiments and make claims then that appear to contradict what the church is saying. Now, before I get into the negative side of the church's response, I think it's important again to move away from crude oversimplifications, to use that phrase I mentioned earlier, and recognize that within the church there were people who were very interested in new knowledge, new scientific discovery, new advances in medical science in particular. So to take one example, somebody I think what I mentioned to you before is Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard of Bingen, great mystic, a great woman of influence in the Middle Ages, which was extraordinary, because at the time most mystics and most women were not. It wasn't a case of they were seen but not heard; they weren't even seen. Difference of Hildegard's case was that the most influential figure in the church at her time was Bernard of Clairvaux, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and those of you who will have read the first handout I gave you on suffering, will have come across Bernard Clairvaux. But he had huge influence, and basically he made it public that Hildegarda Bingen was someone who, as in his terms, was a mouthpiece of God, and therefore she was someone that everyone needed to listen to, in the church and in state. So we have hundreds of the letters that she wrote, copies of them, and that she wrote to the Pope, she wrote to the King of England, she wrote to the Roman Emperor, she wrote to kind of all of the leading church figures and political figures over time, because she was interested in changing things. And she was someone who was not threatened by alternative explanations. In fact, she was someone who had a great intellectual thirst for knowledge, and while she was a woman of great faith and had visions was famous for her visions of God in her mystical experiences. She was also, though, very much someone with her feet on the ground, and was interested in what was going on in the world all around her. So she was someone who took an interest in science, and particularly medical science, because she was also, and is considered, a very influential healer. I myself went to spend some time in her monastery in Germany, to study her spent a few days there. But while I was there, I also met a medical doctor. I was there to study her theology. The medical doctor, though, was there to discover her writings on healing and on medicine. Now, some of those, I think I might have mentioned it before, were writings that we would not be encouraging today, particular the drinking of the blood of bats, particularly I think since COVID, that kind of thing is something we probably would be steering well clear of. But there were other things, though, where it was clear she had studied science and had used that to try and kind of probe in more detail the whole idea of healing and how healing can be done. Now, in fact, the direction that she largely went down, and where she's considered kind of a leading light in her field, is in the area of what today we call complementary medicine, things like herbs and so on. But she was a healer, and she recognized that science, and medical science in particular, had a role to play in that respect, even though her primary interest was, as I said, in the field of complementary medicine. So she didn't shut it down, and she wasn't threatened by it. The other thing that makes her interesting is that, again, she didn't see power as a bad thing. When I say power, I mean political, secular power. She didn't think it was a bad thing. However, she felt that it was important to use power properly. As many of you know, we have often a very hostile attitude towards power, and it's typified in the famous phrase from Lord Acton: "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Now, Hildegarda Bingen wasn't on that pathway, because she believed that power, when it's used well, is a good thing, and that if we are, as Christians, are doing our job properly, we'd embrace power, because it gives us the chance to change things and to make things better and to help people. So, but that power had to be used well, and she's kind of way ahead of her time. Like 800 years ago, she didn't use the word transparency or accountability, But basically, that's what she's calling for. She had different phrases for it, for those two things, accountability and transparency. But she said basically, if you're a leader, you have to be accountable for how you use your power, and you have to be transparent in how you use it. So incredible. This woman was way ahead of her time. And I think I might have said to you previously, she was the first person to use the word green. Viridatis translates as greenness, which is extraordinary. Like she was ahead of the green movement by 800 years. Just extraordinary. But it showed like how far-seeing she was, but also kind of how intellectually open she was. Does that mean she said, let's have a free-for-all? No. But she recognized, again, she didn't use this phrase, partner in conversation, but she practiced it to say, listen, if somebody has some interesting scientific insights, I'm happy to hear them. If someone has some interesting medical science issues, I'm happy to hear them. Will I accept everything they say? Probably not, but there might be things I can learn from. And if that's the case, I'll be happy to take them on board. So in people like Hildegarda Bingen, we do not see a hostile attitude towards science. We kind of see it as an opportunity in her case and other people like her as a potential resource that can be used for the advancement of humankind. So there was that strand in the church as well. And again, I think it is like in my lifetime, genetics has become such a key thing. The Human Genome Project, which most of you will be too young to remember the 1980s, I'm sure. But like the mapping of the human genome, such a big project in the 1980s, and talk about the new frontier for science. So, but to think that whole science of DNA and genetics can be traced back to an Augustinian monk, Mendel, is I have to say I think it's very kind of impressive. And obviously in areas like crime today with DNA testing and so on, this genetics Mendel has had, you could argue very few people in human history have had a greater impact on modern life than the life of this Augustinian monk. He began his work by a study of peas. That's how he began his studies that have revolutionized the way we think about genetics and the way we think about people. And even if you look back now at the writers like Thomas Aquinas, the most brilliant mind of his not just generation, but of his entire generation of generations, his understanding of person we see today is flawed because it's based on an old understanding of science, genetics, the body, and so on. So Mendel and Hildegarda Bingen show that there were people within the church who not only were not hostile to science, but in their way embraced it in a critical way. It wasn't about, they weren't seduced by it, they weren't going to shut down their critical faculties to examine it. They saw it as a potential resource for the betterment of people and the society in which they lived in. However, that was not the majority view. Majority view was quite different, and again, that's why we're back with Augustine and that dualistic understanding. Because people like Copernicus and Galileo in astronomy and different areas about the Earth rotating around the sun and all those kind of areas, their new theories the church was hostile to. Now, again, back to this idea about you have to understand the context. So basically, in times of threat or stress, we all we're more defensive. Whereas when we're comfortable and secure in ourselves, where we can allow other people to say things that are critical of us, because we feel at ease with ourselves. But in times when we don't feel at ease, we're kind of quite sensitive to criticism. Obviously, a lot of us, I'm sure, are sensitive to criticism at any time, but it's particular when we feel vulnerable or exposed or defenseless or under threat or under siege, we're more likely, I think it's fair to say, to kind of lash out or to be defensive. And that was very much the case for the church. So a couple of things started to happen. So I've mentioned already the coming of universities, the development of medical science. A big game changer for the Western world was the Renaissance. Renaissance changed. People changed the Western world fundamentally, I would suggest, in a number of different ways. One, it created a lot of wealth. And with wealth comes new opportunities for knowledge, new opportunities for learning, but also means that there's more education of people, because the more wealthy people you have, the more educated people you have. At the time, pretty much the church was operating in a pre-literate society. One of the reasons why, if you go into any church and you kind of look at the stained glass windows, and obviously they're beautiful for artistic reasons, but historically though, they were much more important for their catechetical value. In a pre-literate society, people didn't talk Latin, so they didn't understand when the priest was saying Mass. But what they could understand was when they looked around at the windows and saw images of Jesus on the cross, or Jesus in Bethlehem, or whatever, as Mary and Joseph and the child Jesus, or whatever. They were able to kind of grasp the essence of the gospel stories, and that's why religious art was so important. It still is. Last week I was in the Dominican church in the Dominican convent in Wicklow, and I visited the church there, and they have, I think it's 15 Harry Clarke paintings. Oh my gosh, you could just spend the whole day looking at them. You could do a full retreat without saying a word, just looking at those paintings, those windows, and it just kind of blew me away. And I think we talked previously the Celtic tradition about awe and wonder, and like I was in a state of awe and wonder just looking at those pictures. So the Renaissance created money, which created education, but it also brought, for the first time, I think, a more questioning attitude. So up to the Renaissance, when there were any questions, the church would say, this is the way, this is what we believe, this is what we've always believed, and basically don't be asking any questions, because you're only wasting our time and your time, and the truth is timeless. But with the Renaissance came a much more questioning attitude, and this created kind of a domino effect in lots of different areas. So it created a new interest in the arts, for instance, new artistic expression, and obviously, we had Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, and those will have just this incredible legacy to the world. Now, in many cases, as in the painting of the Last Supper and so on, the church, because it had money, was a patron of the arts, and it facilitated the new knowledge and skills and talents like paintings, different things you could do with paintings, to advance, if you like, the worship and the glory of God with these beautiful, striking, incredible paintings, which have such powerful theological value. If you think of the statue of the the painting of the Pieta, for instance, the one of Mary at the foot of the cross, kind of taking the crucified Jesus into her arms after he's taken down. Just so powerful. And again, going back to our discussion on suffering, what a powerful statement that is. So there was very much a positive side from the church's perspective, but there was, though, that more critical side, and there was also pre the Renaissance kind of, if you wanted the answer to any question, where'd you go? You turned to the church. Now, with the Renaissance, a new phenomenon emerges, whereas people start, these intellectual people, this intelligentsia, some of them start, well, maybe there are other areas where we could find truth too, apart from the church. And that led to the flourishing, or the beginning of the flourishing, of interest in science, in areas like astronomy. Why? Because people are interested. People are always interested in kind of the big questions like, where do we come from? How do we get here? What kind of planet do we live in? Where is the beginning? Where is the end? What's going to happen to us when we die? All of those kind of questions were asked. And pre kind of Renaissance, again, at the risk of oversimplification, answer was always go and look in the church. Now, though, people are starting to look elsewhere. So, I think people sometimes underestimate the importance of a sociological approach when it comes to theology, because certainly you can't understand the scriptures properly without a sociological perspective, but you cannot understand the church's attitude to science without a sociological perspective either, which is why I've been kind of trying to build the different elements of the foundation for the discussion in the sociological approach. So, new intelligentsia asking new questions, and the emergence then of a new interest in science. So all that is happening, and broadly speaking, that's okay. But then, shortly after the Renaissance, we have the Reformation. Now, this is something very different, because suddenly the church up to now has had all the power. But now, after Luther, there is a second church claiming authority. After Calvin, we have a third church, Presbyterian. Then we have other reformers, people like Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland also, who is kind of very influential in certain parts of Switzerland. John Knox, there are lots of other reformers who are taking the church in different directions. Now, why is this a problem for the Catholic Church as it now is after the Reformation? Well, up to now, the church has just spoken in one voice, and the church was the voice of authority. When the church spoke, discussion is over. The church has spoken. Nothing more need to be said. Now, the Reformation, in terms of the intelligentsia, who are growing by the day, as economic prosperity continues and more people are educated, they are looking for answers to these big questions I talked about here. Where we've come from, how do we get here, what type of universe do we live in, what's our relationship with other planets and stars, and is there really a place for God in all of this? So, but now, instead of having just one voice to answer these questions, there are a myriad of voices, kind of like a supermarket for the first time in terms of authority voices. Lots of different people are now starting to claim authority for speaking on these big issues. And that's a huge culture shock for the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church feels under threat. And it's like, it could never have imagined that droves and droves of people are leaving their faith. And also then that whole entire countries, Germany, Britain, are some of the Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, are going down, are turning away from the Catholic Church. So now when people like Copernicus and Galileo are speaking, they're speaking at a time when the Church feels on the defensive. And perhaps had the Church been more secure in its position in the world, it could have said, well, come in, let's hear what you have to say. But at the time, the Church felt under threat. And here were people like Galileo and Copernicus saying things that contradicted what the Church had always said. So take, for example, the idea from science that the earth is round, not flat, when in fact the Bible seems to suggest, based on the understanding of the time, that the earth is flat. Okay, so Church under siege. Luther is taking over, and it appears, his sphere of influence is getting bigger and bigger all the time. Catholic position is waning. So what does the Church do? It decides that it's kind of going to flex its muscles and it's going to quash resistance. Now, unfortunately, that takes it into areas like particularly the Spanish Inquisition, and it tries to, one part of it at least, tries to resort to fear. There was a more positive strand in the Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent, which said that the Church needs to reform and do better and raise its game to do better. But the kind of felt like the institutional church, its main response though was to say, these guys are saying things that contradict what we say. And if we let these guys go unchecked, well, they're saying now that the earth is flat. And if we let that go, what's going to happen next? What's the next thing they're going to say? So we have to squash these people and these scientists. And as you know, Galileo and Copernicus, let's just say they had a hard time. Now, as time went on, the Church found itself again under siege. So the Reformation, what had happened was, instead of just one voice speaking about faith and religion, there are a number of voices. So the Church now is just, before the Reformation, it's the voice. Now it's one of many voices. Still, perhaps in certain pockets, a very influential voice in countries like Ireland, obviously, Spain, Italy, in particular, perhaps influential in France too. but less so in Germany, Britain, and so on. So, church is kind of reeling from that psychologically. But then comes a new threat again, which is the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is perhaps best described as the age of reason. So what was the Enlightenment trying to do? It was basically trying to replace an emphasis on authority. In other words, the church says you must believe because the church says it. And what it was trying to do was to replace the emphasis on authority with the emphasis on reason. So in the Enlightenment, the big thing was rationality, the use of reason. So who is the giant of the Enlightenment? Immanuel Kant, the critique of pure reason. So what he was trying to do was to say, up to now, you did what you were told because the church claimed to know best. Now what I want you to do, what we want you to do in the Enlightenment, is to figure things out for yourself. So what was the most famous example or illustration of Kant's thinking? It was what's called the principle of the categorical imperative. And the categorical imperative means that basically the way you should act is to do what every other intelligent person would do in these circumstances. So to take an example, suppose I am in city centre later on this evening and I see a boy and a girl, okay? And the boy is crying because he's cut his finger and his finger is bleeding. But the girl is fallen into the river and Liffey and is drowning. So I have two choices. Do I go to the save the girl or save the boy? Now, what most reasonable people would do in that situation would be to say the priority has to be the girl who is drowning. So I will throw her in some life-saving gear and equipment, and I will rescue her. And when she's safely out of water and she's got the drying and everything that she needs, then I'll go to the boy and I'd say, what's wrong with you? Oh, you poor thing, you've cut your finger. I'm going to get you to wash your finger in case you get some kind of tetanus issues, and I'm going to put a bandage on it and you'll be fine. And you know what, I've got a nice bar of chocolate here, why don't you have that? So that's the categorical imperative. Do what every other reasonable person would do in the same situation. Now, why is this a problem for the church? It's saying that well, actually, if we go along with Kant, why do we need the church anymore? The church is stopping us from thinking for itself. It's all about obedience, obey authority. And again, what the Enlightenment tries to do is to shift the experience of authority with the authority of experience. Shift the experience of authority with the authority of experience. In other words, saying to people, you can figure things out for yourself. You don't need the church to tell you what to think, or the churches more properly at this time. You can figure things out for yourself, and you can use on your own reason. Now again, as the economic life is changing, at this time more and more people are beginning to get, we're into the 18th century, and as you know, even in Ireland in the 19th century, thanks to the great work of the religious orders, like the Presentation Sisters, Nano Nagel and Christian Brothers for boys, and Evan Royce, and lots of other congregations. I'm not going to mention all of them. But now people are starting, more and more people are getting education. They're maybe not getting secondary education, very few of them, relatively speaking, are getting university education, but increasing numbers are. So this whole kind of questioning is going on. And as there is, one of the byproducts of that questioning is a great interest in science and a desire to try and find alternative answers to the old questions, new and better answers to the old questions, as well as new answers to the new questions. And the church has had basically at this time 1800 years to give all the answers. Now science feels it's time for it to give the answers. So now the church has competition in terms of its hold. Up to, throughout the Middle Ages, the church had a vice-like grip on people. Renaissance weakened it, the Reformation weakened that still further, Enlightenment still further. So what does science try to do? It's trying to come up with new theories, new explanations. And now at this stage, the Spanish Inquisition is over, and it's no longer acceptable. The church can't get away anymore with just kind of locking people up. So that era has moved on. So I feel like the church has to find another response. So in the 19th century, it has it has to find another response. But by this time, the growth of science is really starting to kick in. And where that is, one of the signs of that is with Darwin and the publication of The Origin of the Species. And what does that do? It suggests that the world did not begin the way the church said it did in the Genesis story. Now, today we can see actually maybe they're not as incompatible as we initially thought. It's still possible to be a person of faith and believe in evolution. But back then, the church found it a real threat, because obviously back then people had more literal understanding of the Bible and a more literal understanding of their faith, and were less likely to make distinctions about what's been said and is it literal or is it metaphorical. Today we're much more advanced on that road, but back then people weren't. So it was either the Genesis, if it was, it was the Genesis version or it was the Darwin version. And as of yet, there really wasn't a halfway house. So now, this other thing that's now at this stage, the Industrial Revolution has happened. There is now a media class in society. So these questions are being discussed openly, and the church is kind of feeling very much on the defensive, and the most articulate voices in the discussion are often from the scientific in the media. In the scientific place, whereas the church is doing it speaking through the pulpit, and it has lots. I'm not for a moment suggesting otherwise. It has many articulate voices making the case and making the case very well often. But for the people who are not in the churches on Sundays, which is starting to become, because of the growth of secularization, that the age of reason, the Enlightenment, has inaugurated, the church no longer is, the churches are no longer the only voices that matter or influence. There are people now who are outside the church. And, the secular agenda has begun and modernity, if you like, has begun. So that's bad enough. But then in the 19th century, things start to change politically. So the political context changes. So let's take the example of Prussia, Germany. Germany for much of the 19th century does not exist as we know today. Instead of a united country, there are nation states, Prussia being the most important. 1870 though, Germany is unified under Bismarck. Okay, and what does Bismarck want? Does he want a church state? Leaving aside the fact that Germany is Protestant largely. Obviously, certain pockets like Westphalia are Catholic, but let's say, broadly speaking, Germany is Protestant. But anyway, Bismarck wants to create his understanding of modern state. So what does he do? Where's the two areas that in every Western European country the church has controlled? Two areas: education and healthcare. What does Bismarck want? He wants a German state where education and healthcare are controlled not by the church but by the state. This kind of policy is replicated in France, but what really freaks out the church is when it happens, Catholic Church, is when the same sort of things happens, and of all places, Italy, the home of the papacy. And in the 19th century, Italy goes through a similar type of process. Like Germany has gone in, and even though the papacy is still very strong, and even though the Italian people are Catholic, the Italian state wants a state that is run by the state itself rather than by the church. Again, in the area of healthcare and education. Now, there can be Catholic schools, obviously, and Catholic hospitals, but basically the state wants to take over. So, what does the church do in response to this new threat? And science is seen to be very much at the cold face of this new threat, this new world that is very unsettling from the church point of view. So the church does two things. In 1870, and again, to understand the text, you have to understand the context, to understand, 1870, again, the date of the unification of Germany, things happening in Italy, France, and so on. So the timing is no significance, is no accident. So what does the church do? It introduces the doctrine of papal infallibility. Now, again, papal infallibility is a much misunderstood concept. People think that tomorrow, if the Pope says that, you might remember a few years ago, Pope Francis went to Knock and they give him the Mayo jersey. So if Pope Francis says Mayo are going to win the All-Ireland within the next 2 years, unfortunately for Mayo fans, that is not an infallible statement. So infallibility means when the Pope speaks on a matter of faith and morals in his official capacity of head of the church. Now, that's only happened twice since 1870. And they're both kind of Marian doctrines about Mary, the Assumption, the Immaculate Conception. But why were they introduced then, if they're used so infrequently? They were the way of the church flexing its muscles and showing you're not going to keep us down. So that was one way. But the other way that they did it was in 1869. They published what was called the Syllabus of Errors. And the Syllabus of Errors was a document which looked at all of the alternative theories, economic, and obviously the 19th century big economic shift was the publication of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, growth of communism, socialism. So communism is condemned, it's seen as anathema to the church. Socialism is condemned. Marxism condemned. But in the syllabus of ours, science is roundly condemned. Darwinism is roundly condemned. Pretty much every ism you can think of is condemned, apart from Catholicism, Protestantism, everything else, all the non-Catholic churches excuse me, are condemned. So that kind of shows the pre-Vatican II attitude towards science, that it is condemned. Now again, at the risk of oversimplification, again I go back to Hildegard of Bingen and people like her who were open, Mendel obviously, who were open to science, and in Mendel's case actively led scientific movement. So, but broadly speaking and officially, the church saw science kind of through a very much a hostile lens, because it was offering an alternative explanation to the meaning of the universe. It was also offering then things like a medical science that conflicted with the ethos of the church, like things like in medicine, ideas like contraception, abortion, sterilization, all of those kind of things which went fundamentally against Catholic teaching. So then we fast forward to the calling of Second Vatican Council, which, as you know, next year we'll be celebrating the 60th anniversary of its opening, and I'd imagine that will be quite a big deal. Now, I've talked previously about use the phrase paradigm shift, or sporting parlance, a game changer. So the church publishes a document called Gaudium et Spes. Again, very telling. Gaudium et Spes, sort of hope and joy. Now, very different tone immediately. Hope and joy. Syllabus of errors, negative, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. All of you are wrong. That's horseshoe. Gaudium et Spes, totally different. Joy and hope. Now, the world, attitude of the world, very different. The world in Gaudium et Spes is described as the arena of salvation. So what does that do? The world is no longer the bad place. The world is where the kingdom comes on earth as it is in heaven. And in that, the world now and the things of the world become a potential ally, including science. So what does the church start to do? It starts to engage with science. When I say engage, it does so as a partner in conversation. And again, to stress, a partner in conversation is somebody that I can dialogue with. I can say, I will listen to you respectfully. I want to hear what your position is. I want to learn from it. There are some things about what you say that I will agree with. So, and I think we can benefit from. So, as most of you know, I teach in Trinity. In Trinity, one of the things we're most proud of is our genetics department, because in many ways it will be seen as kind of a world leader, in maybe not many areas, in certain areas. I try and temper the enthusiasm that some of my colleagues have for using very extravagant language. But one of the things that, for instance, Trinity has been trying to lead the way on is with genetics of blindness, and how through early intervention it might be possible to take steps to take people who have what we call a genetic liability or genetic load that makes them risk of blindness, and if we take appropriate measures, can stop people from going blind. Now, I don't think anyone could disagree that that is not a good thing. One of the other things Trinity has been involved in, not on its own, but is in the creation of a gene that will create drought-resistant rice. So as you know, if you think back to all the great famines that you'll have seen in TV documentaries about down through the ages, when there is drought, there is famine because the rice won't grow in many underdeveloped countries. What the genes was trying to do was to create drought-free resistance. Now, there is an issue on genetically modified crops. I understand that, but we'll park that for the moment. And part of the conversation is to say, well, actually, guys, do you know, and ladies, do you know that there is an issue about genetically modified crops and why that might be a challenge for us? So it's, yes, we're interested in the idea of the drought-resistant rice, but we equally you need to hear that we have a concern about genetically modified crops and what that might do for the environment, short-term, long-term, medium-term. So that's the kind of part of the conversation. You say there are some things you have that are value, there are other things that we have problems with and we don't like. And we want you to listen to our concerns in those fields. So that's very much the partner in conversation model now. So in areas like medicine and science, that medicine can be seen to be an ally, and scientific advances can help people. So my father died when I was 5 because he has a kidney condition. Had he been alive today, thankfully medical advance has improved so much, his condition would be just a routine treatment today. So there, science, medical science can be something that is very good. It can help people to live longer. It can help people have better quality of lives. I'm sure most of you will know people who are on medications and who in previous generations would not be alive today without those medications. And that kind of shows the potential that science has to enrich all of our lives. But equally, history teaches us to be wise, and teaches to be wise because of experience. And history teaches us that there are parts of science that are not good. So where's the evidence for that? Well, two pretty powerful examples would be Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction of the destruction that still has implications in Japan today of the dropping of the atomic bomb. And there is a danger, that science can be abused and used to the detriment of humanity. So the partner in conversation is to try and figure out a way between the church and science of creating an environment where science is used to advance humanity. But also the church then asks questions for science to say that science should not be and cannot be used to the detriment of humanity. Unfortunately, though, there are many examples in the past where it was. So that's kind of the new attitude. So we would see science very much as one potential resource that can help humanity give a better quality of life to people who are ill, help people to live longer, help people to reduce pain and distress, and so on, produce more food, produce better technology, improve our quality of life through different things. So, mobile phones are very handy. Now there's a price and a downside to them at times, and social media and all of that kind of thing. But there are good and there are bad. So what do we do then? We in the church, we engage in a dialogue with the sciences, and not just science but also the social sciences. So the social sciences can help us with area to discuss and try and come up with solutions to issues like homelessness, poverty, population shifts, famine, all of those kind of things. So economics, sociology can help us too to gain a better understanding. So if I want to reduce famine in the world or poverty in the world, or to end homelessness in Ireland, I can benefit from discussing people who are experts in housing, social policy, economists. They can help me get a better understanding of what I should do and equally what I shouldn't do. So that's what John Paul II was trying to lead, that kind of approach where science was seen as a potential resource for humanity, and that we could be enriched by science. So the whole attitude is, again, we're back to presuppositions, not doing theology from an innocent place. Vatican II, the world is the arena of salvation. Augustine, you withdraw from the world. You put up a fortress around it. You put up a moat, a drawbridge around the world, around yourself, and you shield yourself from the world. Vatican II is saying, no, take down the drawbridge, take down the fortress, and live in the world. Doesn't mean you do that uncritically. You do that critically. You listen respectfully. You ask questions. When you don't like what's being proposed, you offer alternatives. But you recognize that you don't have a monopoly of truth. You don't have a monopoly of wisdom. And you could maybe learn from these other areas, these other spheres. So that's the whole idea of the partnering conversation kind of model. It's not that now the church says science is great. It doesn't. It says science has great potential in many areas, but it also, as history teaches us, has a dark side, or potentially dark sides, and it needs to be scrutinized. It needs ongoing ethical evaluation. It needs ongoing moral scrutiny. So therefore, we have a role to play in terms of monitoring that science is used for the common good and not for the detriment of society. So at its core, our discussion, or to simplify, I suppose, or to summarise, pre-Vatican II, at the risk of oversimplification, and despite some honourable exceptions like Hildegard of Bingen and Mendel, science is looked at often in a negative way. In the paradigm shift that happened in Vatican II, when the world is seen, and the document Gaudium et Spes is about the Church's relationship with the world. Gaudium et Spes takes down the fortress and takes down the drawbridge, lowers the drawbridge, and says we're going to live in the world. And we're going to dialogue with science. And obviously, the last 18 months with COVID teaches us, think of the vaccination program. Think of, hopefully, the search now for drugs that will take all of these people out of ICUs and out of hospital beds and free up our healthcare system. So science is a potential resource for humankind, and the church recognizes that. But it's also cognizant that we can't do that uncritically. We need to be there, and our role is to dialogue with science and to say, let's work together so that we can create a better world, a more caring world, a more just world, a world where people are whereas people's dignity is not trampled on. And that's essentially a big part of the church's role here as part of the conversation, is to ensure people's dignity is not trampled on. So if during Hitler's reign, people's dignity was trampled on all over the place, leading to horrific experimentation on people in the name of scientific improvement. But now we want to use science. Anyone who's seen films like The Voice from Brazil or will understand what the type of things I'm talking about, where basically people's dignity was trampled on. And what the church is saying to science is, we value you, we respect you, but our job is to make sure that you will not trample on people's dignity again, as you have done in the past. So thank you very much for that, and for your time and attention, rather, and hopefully in the live discussion we can tease out any questions that some might have, or and depending on how the essays go, I might also have some general feedback to offer. So thanks again, and look forward to talking to you later.